Hey there, how are you?
Hello, hi, how are you? How are you
Doing
going?
well. I'm doing well. Yeah, I'm doing well.
Yeah, I'm doing
Thanks
well.
thanks for getting for looping me in.
We
Sorry for
will,
joining.
we will wait for 5 minutes and then we will start the discussion.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
Yeah, so let me go ahead and share my screen here.
okay. First, let me introduce ourselves and after we will start.
Yes, go ahead. Yeah. Hi, Azeemah. Nice to meet you.
Hi, hi, Mike. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well.
Hello,
Yep,
hello,
I can hear you.
hello.
Hey there, I can hear you.
Uh,
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining. A very warm welcome to all of you on the behalf of CSPS, Center for Studies of Plural Societies. Thank you for joining us today for what promises to be a deeply engaging and thought-provoking discussion. This evening, we are here to explore land power, who has it, who doesn't, and how did it determine the fate of societies by Dr. Michael Albertus. The book takes us to the heart of one of the most enduring questions of politics and society: how land ownership and distribution shape power, inequality, and ultimately the destinies of nations. At CSPS, we seek to foster critical conversations around politics, society, culture. We provide a platform where scholarships, dialogues, and where ideas are examined through the lens of plurality and critical engagement. It is my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speakers for today, Dr. Michael Albertus. Dr. Albertus is a professor of political science at the University of Chicago. He is a leading scholar on democracy, and land politics. His extensive body of work explores how political institutions and land distributions shape development and inequality across the globe. Land power is yet another remarkable contribution to this important discourse. We are also honored to have with us Dr. Azeemah Saleem, who will chair today's discussion. Dr. Saleem is an assistant professor at J.K. Lakshmipat University, Jaipur. She specializes in comparative politics, political theory, and democracy studies, and brings with her deep insights into the intersections of politics, society, and governance. Here's how we will proceed this evening. We will begin with Dr. Albertus, who will introduce the book and share his insights. This will be followed by reflections from Dr. Saleem as a discussant. We will then open the floor for a Q&A session, giving the audience the opportunity to engage directly with our speakers. With further ado, let me invite Dr. Michael Albertus to present his work and take us through the key ideas of land power. Dr. Albertus, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks again for inviting me to speak with your community and your group. Let me go ahead and share some slides here. Here we go. So, okay. Are you able to see that on your end?
Yes, yes.
Okay. All right, great. So first I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of how land became power within human history. For most of human history, populations were sparse and people didn't think much about the land. People transited it. Many human groups were nomadic or semi-nomadic and related more to resources and to seasons than to specific plots of land. That began to shift around 10,000 BC and advanced through 5,000 BC with the rise of permanent agricultural towns. Permanent towns meant surplus, and surplus in turn meant specialization and the ability to create political and social hierarchies and to project power elsewhere. So all of that relied on surplus from the land, and the control over land meant the control over surplus, and with it, economic, social, and political power. So by 3000 BC, there are records of land conflict over land in Mesopotamia. We start to see that elsewhere subsequently. By 70 BC, we see transactions over land from records in Rome, things that look basically like sort of like property kind of registries and the like. And so, by that time, and even by the early, several millennia BC, land had become power within human societies, and that advanced throughout the centuries, such that it's hard to overstate how concentrated land became in many ways by the 1700s, 1600s, 1700s, 1800s in different parts of the world. Of course, the picture was pretty diverse across different parts of the world. In many parts of the world by that period of time, indigenous landholding was, still prevailed. But in places where that was not the case, there had been the rise of various forms of social hierarchies on the land that were associated with concentration of land. Things like lord-peasant landholding, which we might associate with, let's say, Russia, landlord-tenant landholding, which predominated in parts of East Asia, the hacienda or the plantation system, which predominated in Latin America, the Caribbean, southern United States, and the like. And of course, outside of that, there were also little pockets of independent smallholding farming. So things like we saw in the northern United States, right, circa the 1700s and 1800s. But in the last 2 centuries, that picture has shifted quite substantially through what I call in the book the Great Reshuffle, and that was driven by a couple of different factors. So population growth, state making, and social conflict in particular, all of them, increased as the demand for land increased, the ability of states to reallocate it and reassign it also increased. So over the last couple of 100 years, population growth advanced, state making advanced, and social conflict increased. And so that sparked these dramatic upheavals in who owns the land and who holds the land in societies across the globe. And that's what I call the period of this great reshuffle. And in the book, I kind of explore the dynamics that drive the great reshuffle, as well as some of its consequences, because while that reshuffle came to mark nearly every society on Earth, it also did so in kind of patterned and predictable ways, depending on how it occurred. And I explore some of the consequences in the book through outcomes like racial hierarchy, gender inequality, underdevelopment, and environmental damage. The last part of the book then looks at how land is being used today in order to address some of those problems that arise during the Great Reshuffle. So I wanted to step through just a couple examples of how that occurred, and then I'll talk about some kind of current dynamics and near future dynamics, and then I'll leave it to Azeemah to as discussing. So the social and the social, economic, and political power of land means that it cuts deep ruts in societies across traditional identity markers or major identity markers like race and gender. One story that I cover in the book is linked to the American experience in the American West, and in particular to the Agua Caliente band of Cahuilla Indians, which live in Southern California. So, like many Native American communities, land reshuffling in the American West for them meant land dispossession. The U.S. government forced them into a lopsided treaty in 1852 that ceded much of their land just after the gold rush started and the Mexican-American War. Brought that land from Mexico into the possession of the United States, and then the gold rush, led people to flock out west, and so land dispossession really started en masse in that area. About 25 years later, then the U.S. government gave the Southern Pacific Railway a right of way through the reservation, and the common practice at the time was to grant every other square mile of land to railroads in order to help them raise the funds, the capital, in order to lay track. And so, as that went directly through the reservation, it generated this checkerboard pattern of a reservation, which still persists to this day. So the Agua Caliente band owns every other square mile of land. And you can see in this map on the right. And then that map was further broken up into smaller checkerboards within the checkerboard patterns, as you see on the map on the right, as the government then subsequently came in through the Dawes Act and other policies to try and break landholding into private plots as opposed to into tribal holdings. So it was this cruel and effective way of breaking down tribal sovereignty and the ability to control their own resources, and it persisted for quite a long period of time. And I did field work in that area, and and talked to people about how that's impacted their own lives. And people told me a lot of sort of moving stories about how that specific way of land dispossession impacted their lives and generated this kind of racial hierarchy within the Palm Springs area, where whites are on top and Native Americans are below that in terms of, again, economic, social, and political power, and that runs through the ability to control land. Another example that I give in the book, which is associated with consequences of land reshuffling for gender, comes from Canada. There's another one from India that probably we'll talk about hopefully in the Q&A. But one of the big ones is occurred in Canada. One of the greatest episodes of land reshuffling in human history. Land, was started to be, doled out in Canada to settlers in Western Canada, starting in the 1870s, in a fashion similar to the U.S. Homestead Act. But unlike in the United States, which allowed some single women to actually claim homesteads at least at a limited scale, Canada did not. And there were, patriarchal social norms and, fears that women wouldn't be as productive on the land as men. And as a result, homesteads were granted exclusively to men in Western Canada. And over the course of the next, 75 years or so, from 1872, hundreds of millions of acres of land were granted exclusively to men in Western Canada. And the consequences of that can be seen in things like, health statistics, income statistics, and the like, many decades later, and even in certain ways up until the present, not only through Western Canada, but also in how those patterns then were brought into cities with migration. So it created this sort of gendered pattern of, power and of land ownership within Canada. When land reshuffling goes well, it can often go, spectacularly well. There are these examples of how, the reshuffling of land can break down social hierarchies and advance development at the same time. And the most prominent examples are ones in East Asia. South Korea, Taiwan, Japan are all prominent examples of that after World War II. The government, transferred land from large landholders to tenants in those cases, and then followed that up with subsidies that enabled families to flourish and enabled parents of families to afford to send their kids to school as opposed to keeping them on the farm. And within a generation or two, that urbanized and advanced the economies of those countries. And there are other examples too. Ireland did this to a degree. The state of Kerala in India, West Bengal as well. They didn't have necessarily quite the same sort of transformational consequences for reasons we can talk about, but they did advance the welfare of people to a considerable degree. But those are exceptions. So in most cases of land reshuffling that I cover in the book and that I've studied, even beyond the book, suggests that land is often used is often politicized as it's allocated and reshuffled, and it's used as a tool of domination rather than development. In other words, politics often gets in the way of having land become a tool for economic development, and that's what happened, for example, in the case of Venezuela, which I've studied. And there's a picture here of former President Hugo Chavez driving a tractor and waving to folks. He began a land law in 2001. It was advanced in 2005 that ultimately ended up really destroying property rights in Venezuela, and generated this kind of conflagration of land squatting and uncertainty in the countryside over who owned what, and that helped to contribute ultimately, in a country that was faring pretty well, certainly within Latin America. It was much more economically, developed than other economies. It was much more urban than other economies in Latin America. But of course, Venezuela has since fallen into, a deep economic contraction and is struggling with authoritarianism, in part on the back of this episode of land reshuffling. Those aren't, I don't want to, and in the book, I don't only highlight problems that arise from land reshuffling. Part of what I'm trying to demonstrate is that not only are these kind of patterns, there are certain patterns that arise and certain social problems that arise in predictable ways from the ways in which land reshuffling happens. On the flip side, land can also be used for good, right? It can also be used to upend some of those deep social problems. And I highlight in the book, how that has been used to address these very same issues of racial hierarchy, of underdevelopment, of, gender inequality, and of environmental degradation. And so I gave some examples just a minute ago of how land was used for economic transformation through the East Asian cases. I also did field work in South Africa, and there are many other examples as well of how land is being used to land restitution is being used to sort of right historic, wrongs that are, racially tinged. And South Africa, I think, is a good example of this. So, since the transition to democracy in South Africa in 1994, the government has been engaged in a large-scale land redistribution effort. And part of that is restituting land to Black communities that were pushed off the land forcibly during apartheid. And so I did some work with communities in the Mpumalanga region of northeastern South Africa. And these communities were pushed off their land in 1954 under apartheid and, dumped in what was termed a homeland, which was basically an area of low quality land that was removed from centers of economic and political power. And in 2008, the government worked with the company that ultimately came to hold this land to return this land. They purchased the land from the community, from the company, they returned it to the community. The community, however, had not had, sort of the training on the crops that were ultimately grown on this land, and the know-how to commercially produce on that land. So, this is a picture of me with a land reform beneficiary. His parents had been pushed off the land in 1954. We're standing in a sugarcane field there. And so what the company ultimately did is they ultimately created a partnership with the community such that the community took that land, they leased it back out to the company. They gained leasing payments, royalties from that land. And then the company also works to train members of the community to manage farms, and to kind of climb up the ranks of the company to help return capital to the community. And so there's a partnership and a flourishing partnership that has blossomed in that particular area, and that demonstrates how land is being used to kind of address that, racial disparities and a history of racial wrongdoing from the past. I give examples of this. I also cover an example from Australia there, and then I have examples of how land is being used to address the climate crisis and the crisis and sort of ecological collapse in different parts of the world. And in that example, or in that chapter, I focus in part on the case of Chile, which has converted about a third of its land into for conservation purposes and for preservation over the course of the last 10 or 20 years. And one example that I focus on in the book is the making of Patagonia National Park. And I did field work in Chile for this, and I talked with the landowner who previously owned the plot of land that is now Patagonia National Park, that had previously been national land. It had been ecologically kind of important in the Patagonia region, but the government of Chile ultimately gave a concession over that land and sold it to private parties, in part because they were concerned about border issues with Argentina. This is close to the border with Argentina. And so this land was, converted into ranch land. It was very heavily exploited over the course of about, 75 years, 80 years or so. First under private parties, then it went through a land reform program. And so it was converted into a cooperative for a time. Then that cooperative was folded when land reform ended, and then that was, it was granted again to or sold off at auction to a private landowner. And then actually in this particular case, some American philanthropist has bought this land and then created a partnership with the Chilean government to donate this land back to the Chilean government, provided that they would conserve the land. And so you can see a lot of recovery going on in this area, both in terms of the species that live there, but also in terms of how it's operating as a carbon sink and as a way of, in part addressing some of the broader concerns with, climate concerns that are being raised across the world. So the book again goes through these different examples and steps through those. And I think, in the last couple of minutes, I just wanted to share a few thoughts for where we stand today on the land, how land power is being used today, and how it's shifting in our, and it will shift in our near future over the course of the next, several decades and throughout the course of this century. So it's easy to think in many ways of that the distribution of land across humanity and its use is fairly settled in today's age. But there are a series of pressures actually that are putting us at the cusp of what I believe to be another chapter in the Great Reshuffle. And two of these big dynamics are climate change and population pressures. So both of those, I think, are going to drive new competition over territory, and that competition over territory could lead to quite substantial changes in who owns the land and how they own the land, both at a national level as well as at a subnational level. That's going to be advanced, I think, in current times by the unraveling in many ways of the current or of the post-war global order and of the post-war norms against territorial acquisition that we've been seeing in recent years. So if you take a look at the map on the left right here, those shaded areas that indicate lands that will transition to crop suitability by the year 2080. And so if they're quite substantial, they're distributed kind of throughout the world. There's not so much in India, a little bit in the very northwest of India, but predominantly Russia and China are going to be, and to a lesser extent, but still a considerable one, the United States. There's going to be a lot of changes in terms of land that's going to become arable that previously was not, and that could be used for farming as the permafrost melts. Also, there are going to be big changes in terms of the melting of Arctic ice that's going to open up northern shipping routes and the like, and that's going to turn some territory that was previously not very attractive for settlement or for production into ones that are indeed attractive. At the same time, other lands are going to be threatened in terms of becoming less productive, whether because they're threatened by sea level rise or they're too hot or rainfall patterns change or the like. A second dynamic is, population projections. If you take a look at the figure on the right, you'll see, one of, many population projections for the global population over the course of the next couple of centuries. Most models are pretty coincide on the notion that the global population is going to go from about 8 billion today to somewhere around 10 billion before the end of the century, after which the global population is going to decline. And in many models, it declines quite substantially as fertility rates are falling throughout the world. We already see this in places like South Korea and Germany, that fertility rates have fallen well below replacement rate, such that these countries are actually shrinking in size, right? And that will extend. And so, that's going to really shift how people relate to the land in many ways. It's possible to think about, in 2150 or something like that, the global population might be less than it is today. And by 2200, that it might be, let's say, half of what it is today. That's a pretty radical change, and would really cause a lot of different, political, economic, and social dynamics. That's a total rewiring, in fact, of how people relate to the land and to their economies and to the globe. So I think those are big dynamics to keep in mind. It's also relevant in thinking that land issues continue to be everywhere. Not only there's this dynamic that I mentioned before in terms of some of the global pressures for land reshuffling. There's a political dimension to that, which we're seeing, by major powers that are trying to acquire new territory. We're also seeing how this plays out in issues of natural disasters and the housing debates and things like that as well. So I'll leave it at that for now. But thanks again for listening and inviting me, and I look forward to comments from Azeemah.
Thank you so much, Mike. It was a very interesting read. I must confess I have not completed it, but as per as much I have read, that is something which, gave me a very comprehensive understanding of how land can be used in terms of power. So, while reading the book, I do have some more than the comments. I'd have some questions or clarifications that we can discuss upon and see. Something that is very interesting that you were also talked during your presentation right now, that how land has been used as a tool for domination rather than as a development, and this has been happening over the period of time since the early age. I would like to start with the last slide that you were talking about, that, how climate change and populations are the most important factors that is driving a new search over the territory. That is fine, but most of them, the argument that that I found was more on an agrarian side, how the development and the transition of crop could be there. But there has been most of the influence on the industrial aspect as well, how the industries that has been established, because the development, the urbanization, and the land has always, or most of the time after the industrialization, has been linked with this industry aspect, the establishment of industry and the impact of those industries after the establishment. So you have covered four aspects where you actually talked about racial hierarchy, gender inequality, underdevelopment, and environmental degradation. So when I was thinking about environmental degradation, I think industry has been playing an important role in controlling in not only the power but also the development aspect, and has been impacting on the climate change. So if you can put some light on that aspect uh, of of that aspect as well. Secondly, when we were talking about land, one thing I really liked about your book was the intersection of gender to a great extent, because whenever we talk about land, gender or women especially has been, on the margin of getting that land power or the property rights. Even now also, if you take the case study of India, the property rights when it comes to the women is very, very limited, and it only depend upon how it has been distributed. It's one third of the other son who has been getting. So this is somehow very thorough intervention that you have mentioned, but at the same time, how one can improvise this gender intervention in order to understand, to have that balance ownership of land. Because once you have the land ownership, you also have the stake, you also become a decision maker. But looking at the kind of society that we are coming from, especially if I take the case of Indian society, that is a very hardcore patriarchal society, both in rules and regulations as well as in its practices, right? So how we can, make an intervention in that aspect. Uh, Also, one thing that was very interestingly when I was reading through the book, that reminded me of the land reform that happened in India in 1961, which actually abolished the feudal system, the zamindari system that was there, and how they actually redistributed it. They did not restitute the land; they were redistributing the land. But how that redistribution debate triggered in that whole politics, and how it can be, how you can use that idea in this current situation that we are that your book has been talking about. So these are the few things that actually came to my mind when I was, because I was reading more from an Indian perspective. I understand that, you have also done a lot of field work in Latin American studies. You have done a lot of field work in South African countries. I was wondering, what about the developed countries which are there? So how they see the land, how they see the land in terms of power and development and urbanization. So I think I'll stop here and we can have a discussion on these lines if it is possible. Yeah.
Great. Thanks for those comments. Should I go ahead and address some of those before we open it up then for Q&A?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks again. Thanks again for the read, and thanks again for the comments. These are great comments and important things to think about. So certainly when it comes to industrialization and industry, you're right. There's been, if you think about the sweep of human history, there's been this really stark transformation over the course of the last 150 years when it comes to urbanization and industrialization, right? So in
Yeah.
2007, for the first time in human history, the balance of people have lived in urban areas rather than rural areas, right? And, of course, like the lion's share of economic growth now
Yeah.
is driven by industry rather than by agriculture. And that dynamic has played out, and how that relates to the land and how that relates to development has played out pretty differently in different
Yeah.
places. So in some places, there has been sort of a kind of a head-to-head competition, right, between landowners and industrialists, and with landowners attempting to maintain a greater degree of political power and to try and make industrialization actually slower and more difficult. If you think about the way that this played out, let's say in Germany or in Argentina, that was really the case, right? In the 1800s and early 1900s in Argentina as well. Well, really, for many years and actually many decades in Argentina throughout the 1900s. In Germany, that ended a little bit earlier, but it ran through the 1920s and the 1930s. In other places, there's been sort of this transformation of landowners into industrialists, right? Or that they've
Yeah.
created a sort of alliance between landowners and industrialists. And so, if you think about the history of Brazil, that's much more closely tied to what occurred, let's say, in Brazil, right? And I have some of this in a chapter in the book, and how there were these, large landholding was always, and agriculture was, and the commercial export of agricultural products was driving Brazilian development, throughout up until the mid 20th century. And then there was this effort to try and redistribute and reallocate land within Brazil, and large landowners pushed back against that. And they helped to organize a coup against an elected president there by teaming up with the military. And then, rather than reallocating that land, the military and with the support of large landowners then opened up tracts of the Amazon to settle land in the Amazon as an alternative to that, right? And so they pushed people into the Amazon, which ultimately had all these ecological consequences and created a disaster from the perspective of climate change. But it also enabled large landowners themselves to start to mechanize their operations and push out their workforce and have people move to these agricultural frontiers, right? And then as they did that, they also started to shift their assets towards industry, such that many of the big industrialists in Brazil came out of agricultural families, and they still kind of span this land industry divide, right? And that's not so uncommon. We see that in many places throughout the world. And I suspect that has occurred to a considerable degree actually in India as well, right? In places where there hasn't been like a radical transformation in land, many landed families and families that are rooted with their kind of wealth and their history in land also start to diversify their kind of portfolios, if you will, and start to invest in industry as well and become industrial titans and barons and the like. The second question about sharing land ownership with women to a greater extent, is something that has really struck me as I've studied land and land reallocation in societies around the globe. I mean, if you go back again, like basically before the introduction of the plow in human history, right? So if you go back 8,000 years or so,
Yeah.
most societies, to the extent that we know, were far more egalitarian from a gender
Yeah.
perspective than they are today. And and the ways in which agriculture developed generated these, or really deepened these gender divides, right? And then when land ownership became important, as populations grew and the like, and states started to redistribute and allocate land and track who owned what, men came to dominate land ownership, right? And then when the Great Reshuffle came in many places and land was reallocated, this is true of the Zamindari reform as well, right? In India in 1961, who did land go to? Just about exclusively to men, right?
Yeah.
And so, men ended up owning just about all the land in many countries. And countries have taken different paths for trying to address those issues, right? Some of that comes through sort of statutory reforms about, joint titling of land between men and women. Some countries allow that, some countries don't allow that. That has helped, though, to tilt the gender balance in land ownership in some places. And with that usually comes, general kind of relationships between men and women over, power dynamics within the household, who makes decisions about, who's going to become, about inheritance, about earnings, about a lot of different things, right? Um, so that is something that's been really
Oh,
important. Some
yeah.
countries, one country I
Mm,
talk about in the book that's kind of an interesting one is Bolivia, which had very
mm, mm,
patriarchal gender
mm,
dynamics,
mm,
and in many ways, ironically, has advanced beyond other countries now
mm,
in jumping towards greater gender equality, in part because they allocated all this land to men, but they didn't create strong property rights, such that when property rights were granted in a more systematic kind of fashion, they were granted in a different way. They were extended in joint titles to men and women. And so they kind of leapfrogged other countries in certain ways in terms of that, the ability to kind of address those gender dynamics. But India obviously is in a difficult position with this. It's a major issue in the country, right? There's a very lopsided distribution of land. Men overwhelmingly own land in
mm,
India, and there are major issues of land inheritance because, of course, the country is very densely populated, and as a result, there's not so much additional land to go around, right? And splitting up land oftentimes between multiple heirs is means that no one is going to be able to survive strictly off the land, right? And as a result, there's people tend to concentrate land and grant land to one heir, and that tends to be male heirs, and that generates a lot of problems, right? There have been attempts at reforming that,
yeah.
but as I show in the book, many times that's even backfired, right? And
Yeah.
created even deeper gender
Also the
gender
issue of
inequality.
this yeah, also the issue of this circular migration that has been happening in India to quite extent, where the men, in terms
Hmm.
of getting a more better livelihood, are shifting towards the city or towards the urban status, and where the
Yeah,
land is left all to the women in order to irrigate and to take care of the land. So
yeah,
it's like,
yeah,
after they do have they actually do have a piece of land, and once they are done with
yeah,
their the work in this in an urban setting, they always come back to their land, but the ownership
yeah.
still lies with the men, although the
That's right.
work,
Yeah,
the rearing, the development that has been done on that specific land is mostly by the women. So that is something
yeah.
which has also also been,
Yeah,
undermined,
you
or
see a
yeah.
lot of these dynamics actually throughout the global South, right? As
Yeah,
like migration is proceeding, and as in many cases, as men are taking advantage, and families are taking advantage
yeah,
of um, opportunities in cities, right, to earn, but they still straddle the rural urban divide, right? They still
yeah,
own the land in the countryside. They still return to that land, but many times they're away. And when they're away, that's exactly right. It's women who are doing the work, right,
yeah,
to produce on that land and the like, and to keep it up. But it's still men who own the land. So there are a lot of issues with that. I mean, and the reforms are difficult. It's very difficult to change culture and to change those relations with the land. I mean, part of what I have recognized as I've worked on these issues of land reallocation and land reshuffling is that many times when these changes occur, they tend to be big changes and they tend to occur fairly quickly. It's pretty
yeah,
difficult to do very small scale reforms that endure for very long periods of time because people are able to organize and undermine them, right?
yeah,
And to circumvent them and to oppose them in such a way that they don't ultimately have much of an impact, right? And so, even if you look at, like, say, South Africa, part of the reason why there's so many complaints and there's so many problems with the political scene in South Africa is because land reform, while it has advanced, it has not advanced anywhere close to sufficient, right? For, when you think about the promises that were made, or when you think about what remains to be done, there's still quite a lot. The same could be said of India, right? I mean, many Indian states, there was a lot of variation in terms of how the extent to which different Indian states pursued land reform. And different types of land reforms, right? Whether it's registration or the elimination of zamindars, that was much more complete. But then, actual redistribution of land and the like, there's a lot of variation in terms of what occurred. But in general, with a couple of exceptions, Kerala and West Bengal that pursued it to a greater degree. Generally, it was quite slow and piecemeal, and people resisted, right? And like you said, it wasn't restitution per se; it was redistribution.
Yeah.
So, it went to maybe people who were politically connected, who were influential and the like. And so, and that continues to be a problem in India today, right? Based on, talking to folks there who are involved in these issues.
Yeah.
Finally, how do development researchers see issues of land and how it's related to development? I mean, there are a lot of issues that are on the frontier, and it depends on, I think, where you're at globally as to the issues that you see at the forefront, right? So if you're, let's say, sitting in sub-Saharan Africa, to a considerable degree, you're worried about concerns about, customary land tenure versus, versus formal registration of land rights. You're worried about large-scale land acquisition by multinational companies. The same would be true in places like Indonesia, or parts of Southeast Asia. If you're, if you're sitting in India, you're thinking about some of the issues that you mentioned, right? These issues of migration to and from cities. You're worried about, or you're concerned about issues of inheritance, and actual. But it's clear, kind of across the board in many of these places, that land is still a really, like the fundamentals of livelihoods, right? You need land, and families need land to survive, not only to produce on the land, but also as a safety net, right? Also as a place to return, as an asset, as a home, as something that if they cannot be dispossessed, that it represents quite a lot for them as a unit, right? And so, trying to relate that to using land for development is in many ways a tricky thing to do, because people rightfully want to remain on the land that they have, right? And so the decisions that they make on that land are in part aimed towards preservation, right, as opposed to strictly thinking about the development consequences for it. But anyways, I'll leave it at that, so we've got some time for Q&A as well. But thanks again for the comments.
Yeah, thank you so much. I do have few questions, but we can proceed with the question and answers.
Okay.
But before we can proceed with one question and answers, I just have one last question about the methodology, because I've read somewhere that it took you 15 years to develop this book over the period of time, and it involved an extensive field work plus an archival work, right? So it would be great for our scholars who are here to talk a bit about the methodology and bit about your field work that would, help in developing whosoever is planning to work on the same topic.
Yeah,
So yeah.
sure. Well, yeah. So first thing I would say is that you don't have to take 15 years to work on a project like this. In some ways, the part of why I say that is because, I wasn't working on this book per se for 15 years, right? I worked on this book for maybe 2 or 3 years. But the work that went into this book, that ultimately went into this book, before I even knew that I was working on this book, dates farther back, right? So, and I'm using material that I generated through field work from well beyond just 2 or 3, the last 2 or 3 years. But the know-how, the knowledge that I've created in the context of doing field work kind of around the world in different ways, all went into the making of this book. And so what I would say or suggest to scholars who are who are getting started and who are thinking about this area is think about bits and pieces, right? Which is what I did. And before this, I don't know, I published 30 papers or something, right? So I did many small projects first, and focused it on those small projects first. And as I did that, I started to generate kind of a broader understanding about these dynamics and how they were related together, right? And so that's what enabled me ultimately to write the book. But it began with these smaller bits and pieces.
That's nice. If anyone
Yeah.
has any question, they can unmute themselves or raise their hands or type their questions on the chat box. Uh, okay, I can't see any of the hands right now. Maybe there. Anyone? So since there are no questions, or maybe people are like thinking about the question, I just have one small question before we
Hmm.
wind up this session. You were talking
Yeah.
about the safety net, land as a safety net for the people who can just go and, they
Right.
can earn their livelihood out of that. What about the places that has been extensively urbanized? Cities like Delhi, where you will hardly find land. Cities in extensive, very packed cities. Cities like Tokyo. Cities like small, the cities which doesn't have much land left. So there are a lot of
Hmm.
urbanization that has been going on. So their livelihood somehow is not there, which as a safe or a safety net which is not there. So in
Yeah.
that situation, do you think to what extent the person who is living in such kind of urban setting can have an impact on their life, can have can have a different power equation with the person who has the land and with the government, because they are
Hmm.
like, land is something which give them a very strong upper hand. But when you don't have that, when
Right.
you have just one apartment which is on, and that apartment and that building is shared by on a single land by multiple people, what about that? So
Yeah.
I just want to understand the concept of urbanization in the context of land holding or as a social
Yeah.
safety net.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, it depends. Again, it depends a little bit contextually, right,
Yeah.
on the urban setting that you're talking about, and the national setting that urban
Yeah.
setting is nested within. But if you're thinking about a context like India, um,
Yeah.
there are there are at least two things. There are many things going on, but two that would be first that first come to mind and that'd be worth highlighting. One is that a number of people who live in these urban areas still have extended family. They come from rural areas, they have extended family that owns land, right? And so they might have, if that is relatively recent, that shift from a rural to an urban setting, that link might be relatively strong. If it's been some time since they moved from a rural area, then that link might not be so strong, right? And so they may not have that connection to the land so much anymore. And that, especially in a place where, property rights are not especially strong, housing is not especially valuable, then that places them in a position of relative precarity, right? Dispossession is relatively easy.
Yeah.
Maybe people are renting, and that puts you at the whims of a landlord, and also makes it easier to influence people from the perspective of government as well, right? So it puts people in a position of relative precarity, I think, especially in places that are, in cities. If you're not in very developed kind of, higher value urban parts of urban settings, you're in a position of relative precarity because you don't have that safety net like you do with the
Yeah.
land, where
Mm,
people came from on the land.
yeah. Yeah. That is absolutely
Yeah.
true. Okay. I can't see any questions in the chat box as of now, but thank you so much. This book was literally a thought-provoking one, because it, took me back where we see land as the, as something which is available, but we see at the time when we are more focused on the space in the debate, in the context of space, how you actually use the land and how the land has been, socially speaking, economically speaking, politically speaking, is an important aspect wherever you go in the world, even in India. So when I was reading this book, this was connecting me to my to India to a larger extent, trying to connect the thought that yeah, this is something which has been, or maybe we
Yeah.
can, especially when we're talking about the solution. So one something that I really liked about this book, that you just not really left at the debate or what is happening right now. You also engage in the kind of solution that we can put up and we can
Yeah.
explore,
Mm.
even if you're looking in the context of India, it might be helpful in setting up the base in order to look for a solution that has been there. So thank you so much. I think there is something, there is a question by Satish. Okay, it's in the chat box. NFHS, National Welfare Health, just to substantiate with data. Okay, he's writing a question. He
I
has
think
written
so.
a huge data on the chat box, which says that only 13% of women 15 to 49 years in India owns a house alone, while another 29% owns it jointly with someone else. Owning land alone is even lower among women at 8.3%, while another 23.4% own land jointly with someone else. NFHS, these are the surveys that was conducted in 2024, somewhere, as far as I remember. So it indicates that more men are, as compared to the women, own property. Around 42.3% of the women and 62% of the men own a house, whereas 31.7% of women and 43.9% of men own land either alone or jointly with someone else. So what exactly is the question? Satish, can you ask the question? I
think it said just to substantiate with some data that
it's
dynamic
just
is
to
a lopsided.
yeah,
No,
exactly.
Right now I do not have any question, but the time you were asking the question in context of female inequality and land, so I thought it would be useful to post this in HSC data. So, and I
thank you so much.
find very valid, like you connected that with the Indian context in terms of female inequality in terms of land holding, and further now we are seeing the new trends of like feminization of agriculture. That point also you connected with. So thank you, and I found this is an very insightful, and thank you, sir, Mike Albertus.
Sure
Thanks
thing.
so
Thanks
much.
for the comment.
Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you so much for this wonderful session. I think it does make an impact on the participants who have joined. These participants, I think, mostly are from the scholars or try to start their PhD or any research work in their coming time. So thank you so much for taking out your time and being a part and of this platform. And it was really a thought-provoking. I will ask all the participants to at least go through it and read, and it will be very helpful in at least setting up the base for further research. So I think that is an important contribution that you have did in the context of land ownership and land. And I love the title actually. Who has it? How? I mean, it actually it itself is quite intriguing and provoking, I must say.
Provocative,
So that is something which really attracts. Or thank you so much, Mike.
Thank you. Okay.
Great. I might hand over
thanks again for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
Hello.
Okay.
As we come to the end of this stimulating session, I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks to our speakers, Dr. Michael Albertus, for sharing his groundbreaking research, and Dr. Azeemah Saleem for her insightful reflections. The discussion has reminded us how land as a resource continues to shape politics, power, and equality across society. The questions raised here are not only theoretical but deeply relevant to our own context and times. On behalf of CSPS, myself, Zaid, I also want to thank you all for the audience for joining us and for your thoughtful questions. We look forward to welcoming you at our future events and continuing these important conversations. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much. Thank you, Azeemah. Thank you, Mike. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.